The headline hit like a thunderbolt on January 3, 1971. U.S. rains havoc on Vietnam, secret weather war exposed. Jack Anderson's column sprawled across the Washington Post, ink still damp as it landed on doorsteps and Pentagon desks. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Soyster sat in his Udon Thani office, pipe cold, the paper crumpled in his fist. For years of Operation Popeye, thousands of sorties, a drowned Ho Chi Minh Trail, a war bent by water, and now this, a leak that wouldn't wash away. Anderson's words burned. The Air Force has turned clouds into weapons, seeding monsoons to flood North Vietnamese supply lines and civilian villages. Millions spent, lives uprooted, all in secret. He'd gotten it from Captain Daniel Ruiz, Soyster knew. 3 years since the captain's memo slipped to a Bangkok reporter, festering quiet until Anderson sniffed it out. Ruiz, discharged but unbroken, had handed over logs, radar prints, enough to make it stick. Soyster slammed the paper down, ash scattering from his pipe. He'd kept Popeye tight, classified, deniable, until now. The phone rang a shrill jab, and he snatched it. "Yeah, Colonel," came a clipped voice, General Vance, from D.C. "Congress is losing its mind. Hearings start tomorrow. You're on a plane tonight." Soyster's gut twisted. "They've got nothing, guesses, no proof." "They've got enough," Vance snapped. "Anderson's got names, dates, your name. Public's howling, and the budget's under fire. Get here." The line clicked dead. Soyster stood, boots thudding as he stormed to the hangar. Rain streaked the tarmac outside, a faint echo of the storms he'd birthed. For years, $12 million sunk, taxpayer cash for planes, iodide dry ice, and it had worked. Enemy logistics crippled, GIs spared. Now it was unraveling, and he'd fight tooth and nail to save it. In Washington, the Capitol buzzed, a hornet's nest kicked wide. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing as congressmen thundered inside. The leak had ignited a firestorm, anti-war protests swelled, dovish senators smelled blood. "Weather warfare," one bellowed on the news, waving Anderson's column. "Millions wasted while kids drown." The economic angle hit hard. $12 million over 4 years, a secret war chest exposed when coffins still rolled home. Dr. Claire Henshaw landed at Dulles that evening, summoned from UCLA where she'd retreated after quitting Popeye in '69. Her stomach churned as she stepped off the plane, a subpoena in her bag like a lead weight. She tried to bury it, lab work, lectures, clean slates, but Ruiz's leak dragged her back. Anderson had named her too. Dr. Claire Henshaw, civilian scientist, designed the rainmaking tech. True and damning. She met Soyster at the Capitol the next morning, his fatigues swapped for a stiff suit, pipe stashed. He looked older, lines carved deeper, but his eyes still blazed. "You ready, Doc?" he asked, voice low as they climbed the marble steps. "No," she said, clutching her briefcase, charts, notes, all she'd kept. "But I'm here." The hearing room was a circus. Senators at a long bench, aides scurrying, spectators packed tight. Senator William Fulbright, a hawk-turned skeptic, banged the gavel, his drawl sharp. "Order. We're here to dissect this Operation Popeye." Colonel Soyster, front and center. Soyster strode up, swearing in with a grunt. Fulbright waved Anderson's column. "Explain this, sir. Weather as a weapon? Flooding villages? Tax dollars for rain." Soyster leaned to the mic, unflinching. "It's simple, Senator. The Ho Chi Minh Trail fed Hanoi's war. Guns, ammo, death for our boys. We drowned it. Saved lives. Worked like a charm. At what cost?" Fulbright shot back. "Millions spent, 12 by our count, while civilians suffered. Floods, disease, starvation. You call that victory?" "War's cost," Soyster said, jaw tight. "Their supplies stopped, our casualties dropped. 12 million's cheap next to boots on the ground. You want Hanoi winning." Murmurs rippled, some nods, some scowls. Claire watched, her throat dry. He was good, blunt, unapologetic, but the room smelled blood. Fulbright turned to her. "Dr. Henshaw, your turn. You built this. Tell us." She rose, legs unsteady, and took the stand. Cameras clicked, a harsh glare. I developed the seeding tech," she began, voice catching. "Silver iodide, dry ice to boost rainfall. It worked, yes, but..." "But what?" Fulbright pressed, leaning forward. Claire swallowed, glancing at Soyster. His stare bored into her. "Don't fold, Doc." She opened her briefcase, pulling a chart. Rain bands sprawling 20 miles, red zones marking villages. "It's spread," she said louder. "Beyond the trail, flooded civilian areas, disrupted ecosystems. I warned them. Warned who? A senator cut in. The colonel, the Air Force, she said, meeting Soyster's eyes, then away. The science worked, but at a cost: floods, crops lost, lives uprooted. I couldn't control it. Soyster's fist clenched, but he stayed silent. Fulbright pounced. So you knew, Colonel, and pushed anyway? It's war, Soyster growled. Collateral's part of it. We hit the enemy harder than they hit us. That's the point. The room erupted, shouts from the gallery, gavels banging. Claire sat, hands trembling, her testimony a crack in Soyster's wall. She'd told the truth, or part of it, enough to damn them, not enough to absolve herself. The economic fallout loomed. $12 million, a public scandal now, budgets slashed as voters raged. Outside, protesters chanted, "No more rain. No more war." Their signs bleeding ink in the D.C. drizzle. Soyster stormed past her after the gavel fell, muttering, "You should have kept quiet, Doc." She didn't reply, the chart still in her lap, red zones like bloodstains. Congress raged on, subpoenas flying, Ruiz next, then pilots. Anderson's leak had broken the storm wide, and Soyster scrambled, a bulldog cornered. Claire lingered, the roar of the crowd in her ears, knowing this was just the start. The rain they'd sown was falling back, on them all. The floodwater lapped at Min's knees, a cold, brown tide that swallowed the last of his village. It was mid-1971, for years since the rains turned tyrant, and the Say Bangfai River had claimed everything, paddies, huts, hope. Min stood in the wreckage of his home, a bamboo frame tilting into the muck, and hefted a sack of salvaged rice onto his shoulder. His son, Tam, was gone, lost to fever 2 years back, a casualty of the endless wet, and the weight of that loss bent him more than the load. Around him, the village stirred, a ragged exodus forming. Old Vin, the elder, leaned on a staff, his voice hoarse over the drizzle. "North," he croaked. "Higher ground. This place is dead." The others nodded. 20 souls, all that remained, bundling pots, nets, whatever the flood hadn't taken. Min joined them, boots sucking mud, his eyes on the swollen river. The rain had eased this season, a faint mercy, but the damage lingered, etched in drowned fields and hollow faces. He trudged north, the sack chafing his neck, when something glinted in the mire, a metal tube, dented and streaked with rust. He knelt, prying it free. A canister, its label faded but stamped with faint English letters, AGI. Silver iodide, though Min didn't know it, a relic from a crashed WC, 133 years back, one of Tanner's early runs. He turned it over, puzzled by its weight, and tucked it into his sack. A talisman, maybe, or just junk. Either way, it was his now. The trek stretched hours, the survivors silent, but for the slosh of feet. Min's mind drifted to Tam, his cough, his fever, the night he'd slipped away under a leaking roof. The rain had killed him, slow and sure, and Min blamed spirits then. Now, he wasn't sure. Something bigger loomed, a force beyond ancestors, but he had no name for it. The canister clinked in his sack, a mystery he'd never unravel. Half a world away, Lieutenant Jake Tanner sat grounded in Udon Thani's barracks, a bottle of warm beer sweating in his hand. The planes were quiet. Sorties halted since Anderson's expose hit, Congress yanking the leash. He'd flown his last drop a month ago, rain hammering the trail, but the news broke it wide. Popeye exposed, the world watching. His wings were clipped now, orders pending, and the silence gnawed at him. He tipped the bottle back, the taste flat, his eyes on a cracked window streaked with rain. For years of flying, seed soak, repeat, and he'd seen it all. The trail bogged, yes, but villages too, flooded dots he couldn't unsee. The routine had numbed him once, Soyster's voice in his head. "War's messy, Tanner." But the numbness cracked when the papers screamed. Weather war. Civilian toll. His hands had done that, and the weight sank deep. He'd glimpsed faces below, tiny, fleeting, over the years. A kid splashing in floodwater. A man like Min slogging through mud. He hadn't known their names, their losses, but they haunted him now, shadows in the rain. The barracks radio buzzed, a stateside broadcast filtering through. Protests swell, millions wasted, innocents drowned. Tanner's grip tightened, beer sloshing. Innocence. That was the word that stuck. Back in Laos, Min's group reached a rise, dry patches peeking through the wet. Vin slumped against a tree, panting, as the others dropped their loads. Min set his sack down, the canister rolling free. He picked it up, tracing its dents, a strange comfort in its heft. "What's that?" a woman asked, her voice weary. "Don't know," Min said, shrugging. "Found it. Maybe luck." She nodded, too tired to care, and they built a fire, the first dry flame in months. Min sat, Tam's absence a ghost beside him, and stared at the canister. It meant nothing to him, a tool of the sky he'd never grasp, but it tied him to Tanner, to Soyster, to Claire, a thread of ruin he'd never trace. At Udon, Tanner drained the bottle, tossing it into a corner where it clinked against others. The radio droned on. Hearing's rage, Colonel Soyster defiant. He'd seen Soyster that morning, storming the hangar, barking at crews to stand by. The old man wouldn't bend, but Tanner felt the break, his own quiet and slow. He'd flown proud once, a rainmaker, but the faces below drowned that pride and guilt he couldn't shake. Min poked the fire, sparks rising into the damp night. The rain had stopped, for now, but the river's scars stretched behind them, a land abandoned. He clutched the canister, a cold weight, and wondered why the world had turned so wet. Ignorance didn't absolve intent, Claire had said in D.C., but Min didn't know her words. He knew only loss, and the talisman that marked it. Tanner stood, swaying, and stumbled to the window. The drizzle blurred the tarmac, a mirror to the floods he'd sown. Min trekked on, a father without a son, clutching a piece of the machine that broke him. The storm had burst above and below, and neither knew the other's name. The United Nations General Assembly Hall thrummed with tension, a cavern of polished wood and sharp voices. It was late 1971, weeks after Jack Anderson's exposé cracked Operation Popeye wide, and the world had turned its eyes to New York. Diplomats from dozens of nations packed the seats, their murmurs a rising tide as the Soviet delegate, a dour man named Petrov, took the floor. His words, translated live, cut like ice. The United States, he declared, jabbing a finger at the American delegation, has waged ecological warfare on Vietnam. Floods as weapons, civilians as targets. This Popeye is a crime against nature, against humanity. He waved Anderson's column, now global news. We demand sanctions, reparations, an end to this imperialist madness. Applause erupted, sharp and uneven. Eastern Bloc allies loudest, neutrals nodding grimly. The U.S. delegate, a sweating careerist named Hargrove, fumbled a rebuttal about military necessity, but it drowned in jeers. France's ambassador stood next, voice crisp. Weather control threatens us all, today Vietnam, tomorrow Europe. Ban it. The room boiled, a chorus of outrage echoing off the domed ceiling. In Udon Thani, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Soyster watched the broadcast on a grainy TV in the hangar, pipe smoldering between his teeth. He'd flown back from D.C. hearings to rally the crews, but the UN's fury hit like a gut punch. Sanctions loomed, trade hits, fuel cuts, economic shrapnel from his reign. Allies like Thailand fidgeted, fearing their bases tied them to the mess. Soyster's jaw tightened. He drowned the trail, saved GIs, and now they called him a villain. Bullshit, he muttered, smoke curling. They'd cheer if it was their war. He turned to the mechanics tinkering on a WC-130. Keep her ready. This blows over. Back in Washington, Dr. Claire Henshaw sat in a Capitol hallway, the UN feed crackling through a radio nearby. She'd testified days ago, charts, warnings, truth, and the backlash sealed it. Her briefcase held resignation papers, scrawled that morning after a sleepless night. She'd quit Popeye in '69, fled to UCLA, but the hearings dragged her back, and now the world judged her work. France's words stung. Tomorrow Europe. Her science a Pandora's box she'd cracked open. She stood, legs stiff, and marched to Soyster's D.C. liaison office, a cramped room reeking of coffee and stress. He'd left for Thailand, but she dropped the papers on his desk anyway, a note pinned, "I'm done." CH. The UN roared in her ears, sanctions, bans, and she saw the economic hit coming. Millions wasted, defense budgets slashed, her career a footnote in the wreckage. She'd built it to help, not harm, but intent didn't wash the flood away. Soyster's voice broke her reverie, replayed on the Senate feed she'd dodged earlier. She slipped into the hearing room, standing at the back as his testimony looped on a screen. Senator Fulbright grilled him. "The world's condemning us, Colonel. Floods, ecological ruin. You regret it." Soyster leaned to the mic unbowed, his suit rumpled but eyes fierce. "Regret? No, sir. I'd do it again. We hit Hanoi where it hurt, trails a swamp, our boys lived. Their diplomats can cry all they want. War's not a tea party." The room bristled, senators scowling, aides whispering. Fulbright snapped. "And the cost? Civilians dead, allies turning, millions down the drain." "Worth it," Soyster cut in, voice a growl. "You want regret? Ask Hanoi why they kept fighting." Claire turned away, his defiance a wall she couldn't breach. He'd never bend. War was his god, results his gospel. She'd warned him, spread chaos, fallout, and he'd pushed, blind to the tide now crashing back. The UN's ban loomed, a treaty in the works, and she saw her future. Ostracized, her science tainted. She stepped into the rain-soaked DC night, the drizzle a faint echo of Laos. Protesters chanted blocks away. No more rain. Their voices raw. Claire quit not for them, but herself, guilt, fear, a line she'd crossed and couldn't uncross. Soyster stood unrepentant, a bulldog in the storm, but she was done weathering it. The UN hall echoed on, Petrov's voice rising. This ends now. Claire walked away, the backlash ringing, knowing the flood had swept them all. The Udon Thani airbase lay quiet under a rare clear sky, the rain paused like a held breath. It was late 1971, weeks after the UN's condemnation and congressional hearings tore Operation Popeye apart. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Soyster stood in a back office, a shredder growling as it chewed through flight logs, dates, coordinates, iodide counts. Orders had come from DC, bury it deep and fast. The brass wanted deniability, a clean slate before the treaty talks locked weather weapons away. Soyster fed another stack into the machine, his pipe cold, his jaw set. For years of work, thousands of sorties, a trail drowned, lives saved, reduced to confetti. Anderson's leak had blown the lid off, and now the Pentagon scrambled, shredding evidence while senators howled and allies balked. He didn't flinch. War was war, and he'd done his job. If they wanted to play coward, he'd comply, but he'd never apologize. Outside, Captain Daniel Ruiz watched from the shadows, discharged papers in his pocket, but fire in his veins. He'd been cashiered after the hearings, labeled a traitor for feeding Anderson, but he'd kept copies, radar prints, memos, Claire's early warnings. A duffel at his feet held the stash, smuggled out before the purge began. He'd vowed justice in that rain-soaked hangar 3 years back, and this was it, truth they couldn't shred. He slipped into a supply shed, the air thick with oil and dust, and hid the duffel under a tarp. The military could bury their half. He'd keep his, a ticking bomb for the right moment. Ruiz leaned against the wall, rain scars on his boots, and muttered, "You won't erase this." He'd find a way, another reporter, a lawyer, someone to make it stick. Loyalty had broken him, but truth would mend it. Across the base, Lieutenant Jake Tanner paced the barracks, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in hand. The planes were grounded, crews scattered, Popeye on ice. He'd flown the last sortie before the halt, rain pounding the trail, but the hearings, Claire's testimony, Ruiz's leak, cracked him open. He'd seen the floods, the faces below, and now the world knew. The cover-up order hit that morning. Destroy all records. Tanner's gut churned. He'd sown the storm, and they wanted it gone. He stumbled to Soyster's office, bottle swinging, the shredder's whine a buzzsaw in his ears. Soyster looked up, papers mid-feed, and grunted, "You're drunk, Tanner." "Damn right," Jake slurred, leaning on the doorframe. "Shredding it, huh? For years, my hands, your orders, and you're tossing it like trash." Soyster didn't pause, shoving another log in. "Orders, Lieutenant. Brass says clean house. We're done." Jake stepped closer, whiskey splashing his boots. "Done. I flew those runs, saw the villages, the kids in the water. You said it was war's mess. Now it's nothing." Soyster's hands stilled, eyes narrowing. "It's war's mess, yeah. We hit the trail, saved GIs. That's what matters. You want to cry about it, go home." Jake slammed the bottle on the desk, glass rattling. "I'm not crying, I'm asking. We drowned civilians, our own damn outpost once. And you're fine with it? No regrets?" Soyster stood, looming, his voice a low growl. "Regrets? I sleep fine, Tanner. Hanoi's mules stopped, our boys lived. War's dirty, always was. You flew proud once, don't turn soft now." "Proud?" Jake laughed, bitter and raw. "I see 'em every night, faces in the flood. You bury that, it don't go away." Soyster snatched a log, ripping it in half before the shredder could. "Then drink harder, Lieutenant. It's over, Congress, the UN, they've got their pound of flesh. We move on." Jake stared, the shredder's hum filling the gap. Soyster's wall held, loyalty to the mission, uncracked by guilt. Jake's broke months ago, over Laos, over Min's world he'd never name. He'd followed orders, trusted the cause, but the cover-up snapped it, truth trashed, his hands still wet. "You're a bastard," Jake muttered, grabbing the bottle. "War's dirty, sure, but this? Hiding it? That's cowardice." Soyster's pipe hit the desk, ash scattering. "Call it what you want. I'd do it again, every drop. Get out. Jake staggered back, whiskey sloshing, and lurched into the night. The air was cool, the bass eerie without the roar of planes. He drank, the burn drowning nothing, Soyster's words a lash. I'd do it again. Loyalty versus truth. Jake picked the bottle, but Ruiz picked the fight, stashing proof in the dark. Soyster fed the last log, the shredder choking on it, and lit his pipe. Smoke curled, a shroud over the mess. The military buried what it could, records, blame. But Ruiz's stash lingered, a fracture they couldn't seal. Jake stumbled to his bunk, faces swimming in the dark, while Min, miles away, clutched his canister, ignorant of the war crumbling above. The WC-130 cut through the Laotian sky, its engines a dull roar against the bruised clouds. It was July 5, 1972, Operation Popeye's last gasp, and Lieutenant Jake Tanner gripped the controls with hands that felt borrowed. 5 years of rainmaking, thousands of drops, a trail choked to death, and now this. A final sortie, ordered by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Soyster to spit in the face of Congress and the UN. The program was dead. Hearings, treaties, Anderson's leak had killed it. But Soyster demanded one more punch. Target ahead. Tanner rasped into the intercom, voice hollow. Trail Junction, Mujia Pass. Clouds heavy. Copy, Hicks replied from the cargo bay, his tone flat. Silver iodide loaded, last batch. Drop when ready. Tanner nodded to Evans, his co-pilot, who flipped switches with a shrug. The plane jolted as the chemical sprayed, a faint mist vanishing into the gray. Tanner banked, watching the rain take hold. A shimmer, then a downpour, hammering the jungle below. He felt nothing, no pride, no thrill, just the weight of years. Numbness had settled after the cover-up, whiskey his only tether, and this flight was a ghost's errand. Soyster's voice crackled through the radio, patched from Udon. Make it count, Tanner. Last dance, drown him good. Tanner didn't reply, eyes on the storm. He'd flown proud once, a rainmaker bending the sky, but the faces below, Min's kind, nameless, had eroded that. The trail was a swamp. Yes, victory tallied in stalled trucks, but the cost lingered in flooded huts, drowned lives. Soyster didn't care. Tanner couldn't stop caring, though he tried. Below, Min knelt by a makeshift shrine on a rise north of his abandoned village, the silver iodide canister at its base. The rain had eased this year, sporadic, natural, but the scars held. Rivers rerouted, fields lost, Tam's grave a muddy smudge miles south. He'd trekked here with the survivors, rebuilding on borrowed land, and now he prayed, palms pressed to the earth. The drizzle was soft, a whisper after years of roars, and he dared hope it was over. He lit a stick of incense, smoke curling into the damp air, and murmured, "Rest, little fish." Tam's absence ached, but the quiet felt like a gift, nature's truce, or so he thought. The canister gleamed, his talisman, still a mystery. He didn't know it tied him to Tanner's last flight, to the storm brewing overhead. In the cockpit, Tanner circled, radar pinging the rain spread, 10 miles steady. It's done, he radioed, voice a husk. Last drops down. Good, Soyster growled back. Come home, Lieutenant. We're finished. Tanner pulled up, clouds swallowing the view. Finished, Popeye was a husk of classified scraps, but the rain fell on, a legacy he couldn't erase. He saw Min in his mind's eye, a father, a farmer, one of the faceless below, praying under his handiwork. Numb or not, that stuck. Half a world away, Dr. Claire Henshaw sat in her UCLA office, a news report flickering on a black-and-white TV. She'd quit Popeye 3 years back, buried herself in academia, but the storm followed. The anchor's voice droned. Laos, 1972, floods persist, monsoon patterns disrupted. Experts link it to U.S. weather ops, now shuttered. Footage rolled, swollen rivers, villagers waiting, a land still drowning. Claire's coffee went cold, her eyes locked on the screen. She'd testified, walked away, but the rain didn't stop, her science, her fault. The final flight hadn't aired yet, Soyster's defiance still secret. But this was enough. She'd tracked persistent shifts in '69. Oversaturation, altered currents, chaos she'd warned about. The news confirmed it. Laos bore the scars long after the last drop. She grabbed a notepad, scribbling, "Flood lag, Popeye's wake?" Her hands shook. She'd built it, tweaked it, failed to cage it. Soyster had pushed, blind to the ripple, and she'd complied too long. The TV cut to a Lao farmer, Min's kin maybe, knee-deep, staring at a sky that wouldn't heal. Claire's chest tightened, a cliffhanger she couldn't unsee. The rain was done, but the flood wasn't. At Udon, Tanner landed, the WC, 1:30 rolling silent on a wet tarmac. Soyster met him, pipe lit, a nod his only farewell. "You did good, kid," he said, smoke curling. Tanner walked past, boots heavy. The hangars echo a tomb for Popeye's end. Min stood, incense spent, the drizzle fading. He clutched the canister, rain easing at last, a reprieve he didn't link to Tanner's flight. Above, the plane faded into the dusk. In L.A., Claire stared at the news, floods rolling on. The storm broke, but its shadow stretched. Lowes whispered it, a question unanswered.